Hello, I'm so excited to be with you here today. My name is Jackie Alderete, and I am really excited to share some powerful information with you and help you really understand what happens when self-sabotage shows up. Self-sabotage is a really difficult thing for most of us to consciously wrap our brains around because most of the problem that comes with self-sabotage is super not conscious. It comes from a very primal subconscious kind of a space, and it's raw, and it totally takes us over and it takes us down, and we're not really sure what just happened. It's kind of like a whirlwind or a tornado that you get caught up in. So I wanted to unpack it a little bit today. Um, Specifically, the flow of this information is going to be me actually reading some content from a book that I have that helps to explain a little bit more in detail, like what happens with um, not only self-sabotage, but kind of the shadow side of our psyche or our patterns of being in the world. And so I'm going to draw some pictures. I'm going to teach through analogies. I'm going to read some stuff in the book. We're going to be all over the place, but hopefully by the end of this, my intention is that you will come away from this training with a clearer understanding of why sabotage happens in the first place, potentially what you can do about your next level of sabotage, or when your next chapter of sabotage shows up in your life, and why it happens, right? So powerful. Okay, so let's get going. Where I'm pulling this information from is a book called Sacred Contracts by Carolyn Mice. I think her name is spelled Miss Mice. I've never known actually how to spell her or to pronounce her last name, but this book teaches all about they're called archetypes that happen in all of our subconscious, conscious awarenesses. And archetypes, basically, they're just patterns of belief, patterns of behavior that organize our lives and teach us and train us to be certain ways. Some of the main archetypes that she speaks about are things like your child archetype, the saboteur archetype. She also goes into things like your queen archetype. There's lots of different archetypes, and they all have different patterns, and they all have different reasons for showing up. And it's just basically the subconscious programming around why we show up in certain ways rather than others. So, like your child archetype is really about being fully present and being playful and like seeing the whole world as it really is. But within each one of the archetypes and the ways of us showing up in the world, there's what's called the shadow side. And the shadow, I don't know if this is a familiar term to you or if this is new, but the shadow side is, I mean, think about a human being, like a human physically can be in the light and you can see all of their features, but they can also be in a shadowy space and it's harder to see them. And it doesn't mean that they're right or wrong or good or bad or good or righteous and evil for being in the light versus the shadow. It just is what it is. The shadow is just unconscious awareness around some patterns in your life. And but the shadow is actually why self-sabotage happens. So we're going to go into explaining this a little bit more. So first of all, I'm sure you've experienced times in your life when you're just going about your day. Maybe you have a busy day ahead of you and you're like, organizing everything. You have a massive checklist and you're like, I'm on it, right? And then something triggers you and it's not your nice side of you that shows up, and like you get really snappy with people and you get really like right. That would be something akin to the shadow side that shows up. It's like your controlling side. um and it's the shadow because it kind of rears its ugly head and you have to do some damage control afterwards. Maybe some people in your life got their feelings hurt because of how you treated them in those moments and those like bitey moments. That's the shadow. It can show up in lots of different ways, but we need to honor and recognize the shadow. The shadow always shows up because of when the shadow shows up, it allows fear to be in the driver's seat. And so when you have your life all planned out, like that's the light side of you, like the side of you that hangs out in the light and the goodness. And then the shadow shows up because like maybe all of a sudden you get tons piled on top of you and you go into like scarcity space and like panic and you're like and you get really snappy with people, like that's the shadow. And because the shadow took over, um, you are then allowing fear to be in the driver's seat of your life. And that's when we really struggle with moving forward, because there's all this resistance and it's like a tug of war inside of us, in our souls. So we're going to explain this. So I'm going to read some of these things from this book, but to help us understand the shadow is not necessarily an evil thing, but the shadow becomes hostile only when it is ignored or misunderstood. And I think that's a really important part to understand about our shadow side and shadow work. Shadow work can be really complex, especially doing it by yourself. And so if you're running up against some of these shadowy things, these shadow sides of you, and you're not quite sure what's holding you back and what's stopping you from moving forward and progressing in your life or your business or whatever you're working towards, reach out and get support. I love helping support women through this. And so if this is calling to you and it's the time for you to start working through this, the shadowy, darker side of you that is a little scary, you're not quite sure how to handle, reach out and we'll find a time to connect. Okay, so let's get into this. There's multiple paragraphs that I want to unpack here. So I'm actually just going to read one paragraph at a time and then we're going to unpack it. And I really teach an analogy, so I'm going to pull up my whiteboard and we're going to draw a picture in just a minute. So the shadow aspects of our archetypes are fed by our paradoxical relationship to power. So this is important. We need to understand that the shadow is really connected into power. So let's remember power, and let's think of power as if like your being, your archetypes, actually like your energy and who you are is almost like an analogy of like a house, right? And you're plugged into electricity, and so that's going to be your power source. So let's use that visualization, that analogy, to help us to understand power. Okay, so and the archetypes are just in this house analogy, it's just the blueprint. It's just the way that your home was designed. Some homes are built out of certain materials, other homes are built out of different materials. And there's nothing right or wrong about them. They're just different, right? And so archetypes are like the blueprinting side of a house. The power is like the electricity that it goes into the house. So the shadow aspects of our archetypes are fed by the paradoxical relationship to power. So if you don't understand paradoxical concepts, it's like that two opposing concepts actually kind of hold the same space, and they have to they balance each other out in a strange way, but they seem to be opposite concepts in nature. And so it goes on to say, we are as intimidated by being empowered as we are by being disempowered. That disempowerment is a threat to our well-being is easy to understand, at least on the surface level. I think we can all understand that. Like nobody likes to feel disempowered. So that means like you have less electricity in your home and you're like, oh, that doesn't feel good. Or to have it shut off completely, you're like, no, thanks. But then why should we also fear becoming empowered? So in your house analogy, like, why do we fear having more electricity running through your home and having more access to power? That's what we're going to unpack. Okay. That in essence is the paradox that feeds the shadow. So it's this paradox that we, at least on the surface, we understand that having less electricity is not a good feeling. Like you can't run all of your lights and your electricity. I mean, your refrigerator may go out. You may not have enough power to run your oven, there's some problems with that. But why are we so scared about increasing our power and having more access to more electricity in your home? So it says that the shadow can be seen as unexplored power. So basically there's more electricity that can come into your house that we just we haven't explored yet. We're not familiar with it. We're not aware of how it works and how it can serve us, right? So that's why it's unexplored. It expresses itself through behavior that often sabotages our express wishes and image of ourselves. These complex aspects of our personalities filter into our behavior by outwitting our conscious minds, after which they often assume a dominant role. So because of this complex nature of this power source, it kind of comes in and it kind of confuses our conscious mind, and it totally takes over and it becomes dominant. So then it says we frequently don't know why we do the things that we do, or why we have to cope with inexplicable fears. This leads to painful conflict when we feel one way and act another, which separates the mind and the heart. So in this house analogy, as I was trying to understand this myself, this is the image that came to my mind. So imagine, again, like we're going to keep the house analogy, but I want to also include a secondary analogy to help us understand this better. So imagine, and actually let me pull up my whiteboard to help draw this. So imagine, let's pretend that this is your house. I love when I draw. It's so like juvenile. It's just beautiful. Okay, so this is your house. And like we just spoke about the power concept, right? And so increased power causes us angst, decreased power causes us angst, but let's figure out where this comes from. So let's pretend that next to your home, you have like a garden space, okay? So in this garden, you have rows of space where you're planting your fruits and vegetables and things, right? This is it's a controlled space. You're working on growing food in this area. You have a watering system, you have a schedule, you're reading it, like your actual energy, all of your mind, like your focus and your attention is going into growing food in this space, okay? So this is kind of like your conscious awareness. It's what we have control over. It's what we understand. We can like see it, manipulate it. So this is akin to our conscious awareness. So then the second half of this analogy is almost like all this wild space that's out that surrounds your property. And I'm just going to draw squiggly lines to show like the wild nature, right? There's trees. I'm only going to draw a few trees just to illustrate this, right? And there's big rocks, a couple more trees. Maybe there's a mountain in the background, right? So like this is like wild nature. And really, when you understand like gardening and cultivating plants and things, like we do have a lot of power and control over that. And yet it takes a lot of energy for us to grow food that way. And when it comes to nature just does things on its own. Nature grows things according to divine law. And we don't have to dictate and navigate and control every little thing that happens in nature. It just does its own thing. It has its own engine, if you can say. So I feel like in this example, like this wild nature space is like our subconscious. This garden space is like our conscious mind. And this is like your house is like your being and how much power you have. And why are we so afraid of increased power, right? Like that's the question that we're trying to understand here. So, so what happens, what I started understanding from this experience is something in nature happens, because nature has a lot of power. It really does. There's a lot of forces in nature that sometimes we like and sometimes we don't like. So maybe there is a big windstorm that comes through, or I'm just going to actually draw like kind of a tornado cyclone-y thing to kind of illustrate like a big storm, like forces of nature that really overpower you, right? So there's a tornado and it's quite destructive, right? And it starts coming towards you. And you're doing everything that you can to stop it, and yet it still comes at you. And I think this is what happens. Like the tornado is like the shadow side of our archetype, because like the archetype, the like our nature analogy example here is like, yeah, our archetype has kind of a wild, raw source of power. And if it's just doing its own thing, it's completely fine. And we're not threatened by it. But when nature like culminates together in a negative, destructive way, like in a tornado, and it comes across your path, it really can destroy your, like what you're growing and your, what you're controlling in your garden space, right? And so that's where this conflict comes in. And in the book, it talks about how when this happens, when like a tornado comes in and it destroys your garden, what happens is it separates your mind and your heart. So I'm going to draw I'm going to draw this in our house here. So I'm going to pretend like the roof is like your head, is like your mind space. That just looks like a funny cloud. But this is your mind. And this is going to be your conscious mind. And this is going to be your subconscious. Okay. And then like maybe the house is kind of your heart space, just because that makes sense, I think, to all of us. Okay. So your heart is down here. Your mind is up here. And when this tornado comes in and kind of does this messy up thing, this is when your mind and your heart stop working in tandem. And I think that's what happens with this power when we have more power or decreased power. Your mind and your heart are supposed to be working in tandem together. But when they start separating and fighting against each other, if there's more energy in both places, like more power, like this positive, like if you have increased power in your mind and in your heart, those things start going at each other, and that can be a little bit scary. And so so there's a break here, right? And these things start like pulling away from each other rather than working toward one another. Okay, so that's where we're at with our analogy so far. My really awesome messy drawing. So the next paragraph, it says that living with your mind and your heart divided is like having two battle encampments within, each one fighting for authority over our power of choice. So again, it's all back to power. Like power, right? Positive and negative, like any kind of power. And when your mind and your heart are fighting one another against one another, it is like war, and they're not on the same page. When they're isolated from each other, the heart and mind are each handicapped. This is another part of the problem. Our heart and our mind are built to work in tandem, and when they are separated from one another, it's like they cut their own legs off. They can't function very well. They can't walk very well. I mean, if they were human beings and like an actual army force, they become handicapped. The mind tends to become hyper rational and the heart overly emotional. Have you noticed those same patterns in you? Like when your own shadow stuff comes up and there's this like separation between your mind and your heart, and your brain goes like into total hyper overthinking, and your heart is just so emotional and you can't handle what is coming up and out of it. That's a sign that some negative unconscious shadow work is showing up that needs to be addressed. Because remember, at the very beginning of this, I said the shadow only becomes hostile when it is ignored or misunderstood. And so if we don't understand this tornado and why it's showing up, or we ignore it, or we don't understand it, right? Like that's when it becomes hostile, and that's when it starts wrecking your garden and it takes away power from your home. And those are not good things. We don't like that. So the imbalance between the hyper-rational mind and the overly emotional heart space, so here and here, this imbalance of forces fragments our power. So again, like even if you have positive, like lots of power, you feel empowered or you feel disempowered, either way, it doesn't matter. Like it's like your power gets fragmented and it gets all scratchy and broken. And like a nation in which opposing forces are constantly at war with each other, when our nature is fragmented, it is vulnerable to being dominated by fear. So this is so important to understand. So once we get to this stage, when our power is fragmented, that is when fear shows up. And I want to like write in fear. I don't know if I can do it. I want to do another color, but I don't know if I can. So I'm just going to write the words fear, like sideways. Oops, that's supposed to be an E. Fear, right? Fear shows up, it kind of hijacks everything and it takes over. So it's not even about feeling empowered or disempowered at this point. So talk about electricity, like being blown out of the water and you're just in like freak out, falling from a cliff with no parachute on kind of a space. It's no good. Okay. So as Jesus says in the Bible in Mark 3:24, he says that if a kingdom is divided against itself, it cannot stand. And so that wisdom shows up in the Bible, right, with Jesus's teachings, that this is why it happens here. Fear shows up when our power is fragmented. Power gets fragmented because our mind and our heart stop working together. Your mind becomes hyper rational, your heart becomes overly emotional. And it really is because we don't understand the shadow of what's showing up. We ignore it or we misunderstand it. And so it kind of comes in and does this destructive work with the things that you feel like you're in control of and in the power in your own space. Okay, so the next section says that even when we know we are acting fearfully, we sometimes choose to be willfully ignorant about it. This is really important. So this is kind of like bringing all this stuff and grounding it back down into our day-to-day lived experiences, our choices. So even when we know we are acting fearfully, so again, when this fear is showing up, whoa. Okay, so when this fear is showing up, we sometimes choose to be willfully ignorant about it. So like, it's almost like when the fear shows up, we're like putting a blinder on and we're like, no, I can't see it. It's fine. And that only leads us into more problems. But I get why we do it, because it's painful. When this fear shows up, it's painful. And a lot of us shy away from pain because it's not comfortable. We don't like it. We kind of go into the space like, I don't know why I'm acting in a negative fashion. And it usually is easier to excuse your behavior in those spaces or to blame someone else. Let's be real in this moment. We all excuse our behavior to one degree or another. We all blame other people to one degree or another. Hopefully we're working on those things, so those things are getting less and less and less. Which is what I stand for. If you feel like you need help with that, reach out to me. I'm happy to schedule a conversation with you so that we can help you work through these things. But the key here to start shifting this whole thing, and I'm actually going to erase this whole picture and start fresh, but I want you to keep this picture in mind here. So let's start fresh. The key to changing all of this. So let's pretend like from that last picture, right, that the fear is in charge, right? And you're like, no, I don't want to see. So you're blinding yourself. You don't want to hear anything. You're not dealing with it. You're blaming other people. So you can either kind of go into like, I don't know why. So we go into like excuses, or we blame other people, right? Excuses of our behavior, or we blame other people. So then how do we get out of this? This seems like a really heavy pattern to deal with and to get out of. It comes down to awareness. We have to practice awareness. We have to be emotionally aware and intellectually aware that maybe you're harming another human or another person's feelings. And you have to work on holding yourself accountable for what you've just created, because all this unconscious stuff that just happened, It happened within you, nobody else, and you have to be accountable for that. Part of that accountability is you have to admit that you consciously chose to be negative, like you chose to allow the negative forces, the raw forces of nature to overpower you. And so I drew a tornado, but another analogy could be like a flood, like a flash flood. So if you have a garden space and all of a sudden like so much rain comes and the water comes and destroys all of your plants, like it's the same outcome, right? Like nature's raw forces, raw power overpowered you. And if you choose to go into a negative space, you start blaming the other person, you start blaming, like in the analogy, like your nature's power, you start blaming whatever. You have to take accountability for your choice to be in a negative space. Basically what we do in this space is we are hiding. So this is a space of hiding from like your true, from your awareness. I don't know, I'm gonna, from awareness, accountability. Sorry, sometimes it's like doesn't write clearly. From awareness, from accountability, of your choice to be negative, right? Okay, the choice of being negative. So as long as you're hiding, this is going to stay the same. You're going to stay in excuses. You're going to stay blaming other people. And this is a lot of really deep soul work. And so if this is a lot for you to process and take in, like take a big deep breath. Let this be light and easy for you to let this sink in. Take some water, like drink some water. Make sure you're staying hydrated. If you need to pause this and like get up and move around, like go ahead and move around. Let your body like process this as you need to, because this is a lot of information. But as long as you're staying hiding here, your mind and your heart are going to stay split. And so as long as you stay there, like you're going to be at war with your mind and your heart. So what are the steps, right? The steps are working on, I mean, it is what I've written here. So number one is practice awareness around how you contributed to creating what you created. The next step, this one sometimes is the hardest one, is taking accountability for the negativity that you created. You may not have been aware up until this point that you created that negativity, but you did. So as long as you take accountability for what you have created, that is what actually opens you up to freeing yourself, to getting your mind and your heart back on the same page. And then your mind, oh, it's so beautiful. And your mind and your heart are then in the same space instead of fighting against each other. And as a result of that, they can start clearly communicating once again, be balanced, and find their true source of power that have been naturally given to them, so that you can work in tandem with working on increasing your electricity again, like that power source to your home. And let's see. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to share with you for all of this shadow work. So, right, we began with this all starting with, why are we so scared with more power, with that house analogy, with more electricity coming in into our home? Why is that so scary to us? The shadow comes in and it tells us, well, hold on, I'm processing this right now real quick. Yeah, why are we scared of more power? Why are we scared of more power? It really becomes, I think, because it's not known to us. And if we allow that unknown energy to stay unknown, then I think that's what triggers the shadow to come in and to kind of be destructive, because the shadow is really raw power. It's raw power that's coming towards us. And I think that's why I created the analogy of nature, because nature does have raw power. Like flash flood, a tornado. That is raw power, and it is super powerful. But when we can harness the power, that's the power of electricity. It's harnessed power. We know how to take power that is in the nature, in the universe, and we've learned how to harness it through electrical conduits. And that's why it feels safe to us. And so as we work on increasing that electrical input into our home, into our being, then we have to learn how to feel safe with it, which that safety comes because we can create higher levels of order, organization and familiarity with that higher level of power. And so I hope that makes sense to you. I speak a lot in analogies, and so if that doesn't make sense to you, please reach out and ask me to clarify. I'd happily explain it to you in a different way, in the way that you need to hear it. But I love speaking in analogies because it really does resonate with a lot of people. We can all understand the power of an analogy and the power of a story. And what I want for you is for your heart and your mind to be one, to be working in tandem, so that your mind, your logical mind, and the emotional, spiritual powerhouse of your heart and the beauty of your learning capacities and the knowledge that you can hold in your brain, that they are working in tandem, in harmony, to help you to move forward in your life towards your beautiful goals. That's my hope and my prayer for you. Yes, if you have questions about this, or if you'd love some more support around really working through these patterns, I'd love to schedule a time to meet with you. I'm offering free calls right now if you are interested in getting some more support around up-leveling your life. So I hope this was helpful for you, and I will catch you on the next training. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.